Hi, my name is Marissa Gillett, and I am the chairman of the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, or PURA for short. Now, I came to the state in 2019, just a couple of years ago now, at the invitation of Governor Ned Lamont. He recruited me to this state from the state of Maryland, where I worked on staff at an equivalent agency to PURA. Now, every state has a PURA. Sometimes they're called public service commissions, sometimes they're called public utility commissions, and I worked at the Public Service Commission in Maryland, helping to regulate the utilities in that state. Now, through that work, I got to meet administration officials and regulators in states up and down the East Coast and nationwide, including officials from the state of Connecticut. We got to work together on initiatives like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI for short, which is a cap and trade program that states in the Mid-Atlantic region and the Northeast participate in. And through that work and my work with the Connecticut officials there, I got to learn that there was an opening to be the chief utility regulator in Connecticut in 2019. The governor reached out, asked if I'd be interested, is familiar with my work modernizing the electric grid in the state of Maryland, and was interested in whether I could replicate that in the Nutmeg State. So in 2019, I moved my family up here, and we began getting to work on learning the ins and outs of regulating utilities in Connecticut. Now, as a state that has the highest electricity rates on a per kilowatt hour basis in the continental United States, there's no shortage of work to do. Whether it's getting the rates under control that these utilities charge, or looking into the rapidly outdated infrastructure that they oversee, there is no shortage of work to do here. And that's what we've been doing these past couple of years. And over the course of the last couple of years, one thing became increasingly transparent to me. And that is that the residents and businesses of this state do not understand what PURA does or how important it is to your daily life. At PURA, our regulation of the utilities impacts up to a fifth of the state's economy. Think about it. Think about all these public utilities that you interact with on a daily basis. And that's the work that PURA does. Now, we can't do it in a vacuum. In fact, the decisions that we make at PURA are not as good as they could be. They're not as balanced as they could be, as if we had residents and businesses contributing to our daily work. And that's really where the PURA 101 roadshows came about. It was in reaction to questions that we get that I've gotten over the past couple of years, and also an attempt to introduce you to our agency, how important it is that you engage with us, and explain some of those ways that you can interact with us moving forward. So thank you very much for tuning into this presentation. I hope by the end of it that we have addressed some of the frequently asked questions that you have about the utilities that you receive, and we look forward to seeing you in our hearing rooms moving forward. So let's get started with the PURA 101 Roadshow. So what we like to do in these roadshows is introduce you to PURA as an agency. We like to talk to you about what we regulate, who is in charge of PURA, most importantly, how to engage with us, how to access all of the materials and the decisions that PURA issues on a day-to-day basis. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the most frequently asked questions that I get in my role, which include, how do I read my monthly electric bill? How can I engage with a third-party electric supplier, and then to provide some materials and contact information for how you can get in touch with PURA moving forward. Okay, so on the screen right now are a lot of words to describe what PURA is, and it really can boil down to this. What we do at PURA is to regulate what are known as investor-owned utilities. So even though these are utilities providing a public service, they're privately held utilities. So when you think about the providers of your electric, gas, and water service, the ones that PURA is overseeing are those that have shareholders, those that are privately held. So think Eversource or United Illuminating if you're in the electric space. In the water space, we're really talking about Connecticut Water and Aquarion, along with a few smaller water companies. And in the gas space, we're talking about the gas affiliates of Eversource and UI. So we're talking about Connecticut Natural Gas, Southern, and Yankee. What we are not talking about are municipally owned utilities or cooperatively owned utilities. Those are different animals. They are regulated by the municipal government and the customers of those co-ops. And the theory there is that they are being regulated by people that are using their services. So where PURA comes in is in lieu of a free market. So what we're talking about here with utilities are natural monopolies. So when electricity really came into being, over a century ago, it was quickly realized that in addition to the aesthetics of having multiple poles and wires, it was really cost prohibitive to have multiple providers of these services. So when you're talking about a natural monopoly that doesn't have the competitive forces of the free market, you need a regulator to step in and substitute their judgment in lieu of what you'd be getting from the private market. And so that's what PURA is. And we're a quasi-judicial agency, which I'll get into a little bit more in just a few minutes. And historically, you may have interacted with our predecessor, the Department of Public Utility Control. And historically, we also had additional oversight over telecommunications spaces and providers, which has evolved over time to have much more narrow jurisdiction in that space. So what does it mean when I say that we're stepping in on behalf of the free market and regulating these utilities? Well, the most common thing that folks think of when I say this is our regulation of the rates that can be charged by these providers. But the rates are set through something called a rate case proceeding, which can happen anywhere between every 4 years to 10 years in the water space. And even though those are very resource time-intensive proceedings, they clearly don't happen on a day-to-day basis. So what is it that PURA is doing in the meantime, in between these rate cases? Well, we do things, increasingly we're getting into the customer service that these utilities are providing or not providing. We are also looking into mergers and acquisitions, particularly in the water space. We monitor programs and that they put into place either at our direction or the direction of the legislature. And we enforce not just decisions that we issue, but decisions that are in accordance with laws passed by the legislature. When I translate that into what that means for you, we have issued our inaugural annual report in early 2023, and I'd like to boil that down to explain to you what that looked like in calendar year 2022 for PURA, and we'll get into that a little bit more in this presentation, how you can get yourself involved or your organization involved in some of the activities that I'm going to touch on. So we've put a huge emphasis on expanding the engagements that stakeholders can have with PURA. That can look like providing written comments to us, attending technical meetings, hearings, coming out into the community and giving presentations like this. Also addressing almost 13,000 customer complaints just last year. A lot of our work is done through something called a docket, which I will touch on a little bit in more detail in just a few moments. But we had hundreds of dockets and investigations that we closed and completed in calendar year 2022. We also, as I mentioned, have enforcement authority. And in 2022, that boiled down to the following numbers. We have enforcement authority over gas pipeline safety issues. I have a team of engineers that are out in the field monitoring the activities of the gas utilities. And those often result in enforcement actions. It can look like requirements to update their training manuals, conduct training. It also is frequently accompanied by fines. fines. And in 2022, that was over $500,000. That same team of engineers engages in monitoring of violations associated with our Call Before You Dig program. That is, resulted in over $5 million in fines issued last year for violations of those statutes. We also issued a hefty number of fines to the electric utilities that we regulate, as well as the third-party electric supplier market. So the point of this slide in particular is to let you know that not only are we regulating the utilities on a day-to-day basis by looking at their rates and issuing directives, but we also follow up with enforcement of the actions that we direct. So what don't we do? Because sometimes it's easier to understand PURA by understanding what we don't do. Unfortunately, and I do say unfortunately because this is one of the number one questions that we get at PURA, is what can we do, if anything, about the broadband or cable providers that you interact with. Now, unfortunately, that market was deregulated several decades ago. And as a result, PURA's jurisdiction over these providers is fairly limited. That's not to say that you can't call PURA for assistance in connecting with those providers, who I know are sometimes difficult to get on the phone, but we do not regulate the terms of their service or their rates. We also do not regulate the programming or the channels that those cable TV companies provide, nor do we regulate the billing of your mobile cell phone providers. Another frequent question that we got, particularly this winter, was whether we have jurisdiction over fuel oil companies. A lot of customers in Connecticut still heat with fuel oil, some estimates as high as 40%. Unfortunately, that is a completely unregulated free market over which PURA does not have jurisdiction. We also don't have jurisdiction over solar providers, which is an interesting one, considering that we have, in recent years, been directed to oversee the implementation of quite a number of renewable energy programs in the state, but we don't directly regulate those providers. So there are a couple of other examples on this screen, most notably that we, as I mentioned previously, do not regulate those municipal providers, but we are in all cases happy to take your call and happy to make sure that we can connect you with a person at those companies to the best of our ability. Okay, so taking a step back to understand more about who PURA is, now that hopefully you have a flavor of what we are doing on a day-to-day basis. If you are familiar with working with other state agencies, you might be familiar with the term secretary or commissioner to refer to the head of an agency. PURA is unique in a lot of ways, and one of those ways is that we actually have 3 commissioners. So it's myself and my 2 colleagues who make up the board of PURA. And the reason that's important is because, as I mentioned a few moments ago, we are a quasi-judicial agency. So if you are a lawyer or lawyer adjacent, this may be more familiar to you. You can think of us as an appellate board in the same way that you'd appear before 3 judges if you're arguing a civil matter, for example. So why that's important is that any decision that PURA makes as a quasi-judicial agency is legally binding on the utilities and the persons that we regulate. And so when we make decisions, it has to be by a majority vote of the 3 commissioners. Now, I hold the title of chairman, and what does that mean? It does not mean that my vote counts for any more than the vote of my 2 colleagues. What it does mean is that the staff of the agency report to me. I have the ability to set the agenda and make administrative matters decisions for the agency and really guide us down certain paths. But when it comes to decision making, that decision must be made by a majority of the commissioners. So following along in those footsteps about what it means to be quasi-judicial and how we reach decisions, The majority, if not all of our work at this point is done through something called a docket. Again, if you're familiar with the legal process generally, this will be more familiar to you. A docket can also be referred to as a case or a proceeding. And what that looks like is a self-contained record. So, for example, if we were asked to investigate what color the sky is, and you know that the sky is blue on most days, we have to go through a whole docket process before we can reach a decision in the matter. That starts with noticing the docket. So we issue a formal notice of proceeding explaining what the scope of the docket is going to look like, meaning what we hope to investigate, what we hope to reach a decision point on. And that's really the first step in this process. And a docket can be started in a couple of different ways. We're a creature of statute, meaning that we take direction from the legislature. So the legislature can require PURA to open a docket. We also can open dockets at the urging of one of our stakeholders, or I can open a docket on my own initiative. So once that docket's open, what do? We next really focus on building the record. So that can take a couple of different forms. We can issue requests for written comments, which are open to anyone following the docket. We can also issue what are called interrogatories, which are formal requests for discovery. Those can be issued to parties, interveners, formal participants in the matter, and they're seeking to get information into the record. Next, we can have hearings, we can have technical meetings, which you can think of as workshops, a little less formal than hearings. All of our hearings and technical meetings are open to the public. You can watch what we're doing, whether we are holding those meetings virtually by Zoom, or sometimes we have those hearings in person in our offices in New Britain and live streamed to our YouTube channel. Following those hearings or technical meetings, we'll solicit sometimes more information through legal briefs, asking parties to summarize their positions before issuing a draft decision in the matter. Even after a draft decision is issued, we can take written exceptions, which are additional comments from parties commenting on the decision we've made. And sometimes we'll have oral arguments where parties get to formally object or comment on the draft that we've put out. All of this culminates in a final decision. A final decision is voted on by the 3 commissioners at our Wednesday regular meetings. We hold these regular meetings every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. They are broadcast by our Zoom channel and uploaded to our YouTube channel. So our information and our votes and the decisions of PURA are all matters of public record. Now, the reason I've gone through this lengthy explanation of what a docket is, and I want to take a step back and rewind to the example of an investigation where we are trying to decide what color the sky is. Now, you and I, we may know that the sky is blue, but absent evidence in the record, that evidence has to be provided through, like I mentioned a moment ago, written comments or interrogatories, witnesses that appear at hearings and offer testimony. Unless I have evidence in the record and it must be what is known as substantial evidence, unless that evidence exists justifying and substantiating that the sky is in fact blue, I cannot make a decision finding that the sky is blue. And that is because of the rules of evidence, the rule of law, and as I mentioned, PURA is a quasi-judicial agency issuing decisions that are binding on these utilities. So all of this is to say why it is so important that we have a diverse set of viewpoints that show up in our proceedings. In the days of old, especially when I first showed up in Connecticut, most often when we were in these dockets, we really had a complete lack of different perspectives in these proceedings on a day-to-day basis. We have the utilities showing up, who obviously have a set viewpoint. My staff are there trying to complete the record. We also have statutory parties such as the Office of Consumer Counsel, or OCC for short, which is the statutory representative of ratepayers in our proceedings. But absent that, most dockets, most of the time, were lacking any additional input. And that's really resulted in my opinion, unbalanced decisions that don't necessarily represent the interests or the perspectives of the everyday ratepayer, whether we're talking residents or businesses. And so again, one of the genesis for the 101 Roadshow is to convince folks of the importance of participating in PURA proceedings and give you a little flavor for what that looks like. So again, in many of these points on the screen we've covered. Most notably, though, I want to pause and comment on what an ex parte rule is, because again, it's one of the things about PURA that is difficult to reconcile, particularly if you're not from a legal field. So an ex parte rule is something that you can think of if you've ever watched Law and Order or Perry Mason or a legal show. You may be familiar with scenes where a judge calls a lawyer into the back room. They always invite the lawyer representing each party in the proceeding. And that's similar to what PURA is required to do in our proceedings. Ex parte prohibitions mean that PURA, so myself, my fellow commissioners, the decisional staff that work for me, none of us can engage with any party, resident. We cannot engage with anyone outside of our agency if a matter is pending before us or is coming before us. So we can't engage with you in any substantive way. We can't speculate about how we're going to rule. We can't answer questions about what we thought of certain evidence. What we can do and what we are trying to expand our services to provide is to be more transparent about the process that we're undertaking and how you can contribute your own thoughts. But unfortunately, we are not in a position where we can have off-the-record conversations about matters pending before us. And that's really for the protection, in my mind, of everyday ratepayers. You certainly would not want me to be behind closed doors with a utility discussing their interests. And the same goes true. The same holds true for myself speaking to ratepayers. So I know that's a difficult rule to grasp. It has certainly cut off some conversations, and we are doing our best to be transparent about the process and the timeline for when these decisions can come out, because again, any decision that we make must be completely transparent and supported by the evidence in our proceeding. So hopefully by now I've convinced you of the urgency and the need to engage with PURA. And there is a real spectrum of ways to engage with us. I'm going to step through a few of those here. The first and the most kind of passive way to engage with us is to get a hold of our online calendar and sign up for email alerts. Like I mentioned, all of our work is done through a docket or a case proceeding. So it's easy to track the different topics. What's not easy, of course, is the fact that at any given time, PURA can have between 70 and 100 active dockets. Now, we in no way, shape, or form expect folks to sign up for email alerts on 100 active dockets. In fact, it is literally a full-time job for many of us who are following those dockets. But we have recently launched quarterly newsletters. The newsletters do a good job of highlighting the dockets that are going to be active for the upcoming quarter, as well as highlighting a few examples of decisions made in dockets from the last quarter. So if you know, for example, that you're going to have a heavy personal interest in a rate case that is filed, the quarterly newsletters, which are available on our website, and you can sign up to receive them moving forward, they will provide you with the docket number, and you can sign up for email alerts just for that docket. If you have a little bit more interest and a little bit more time, you can step up your level of engagement. So you've identified a docket that you're interested in. What do you do next? Well, you can provide comment at one of our public hearings or technical meetings. You can do that verbally, or you can do it in writing by emailing your comment to pura.executivesecretary@ct.gov. Now, in either case, it is necessary to know what the docket number is, or at least what the subject matter is that you're seeking to comment on. And please be aware that any comments that you provide are matters of public record. As I mentioned, virtually everything that PURA does is in the public record. So we just urge you not to put into writing any personally identifiable information. If you do move forward with providing comments in writing or verbally, we also urge you to think about providing evidence and information that could help PURA reach a decision in the matter. So by that, I mean, while it is certainly impactful for PURA and its commissioners to know how many people support a position, so sometimes we get petitions signed by thousands of customers objecting to a rate increase, for example. That is certainly impactful, but what is almost equally impactful is receiving just one comment that says, my power was out from this time to this time. I didn't notice anyone come to repair it until this time, and that contradicts evidence that the utility has put into the record suggesting that my power was restored at this time and that someone was on site at this time. So it doesn't take a lot, but we need details and facts on which we can either base our decision on, or we can use information you've provided to ask questions of the utilities themselves. Finally, and this is obviously the most resource and time-intensive option to engage with us, but finally you can intervene in a docketed matter. Now, we recognize that this can be a high bar. It's generally most successful when you are represented by counsel, but you're not required to be. And one example of where this has been quite successful, we like to show this example both as documentation of how public comment has impacted our decision, as well as an example of how a party formally intervening in our proceedings has made a difference. So what you're seeing on the screen now is a screenshot of PURA's final decision in docket number 200803, which was our investigation into the electric utility's response to Tropical Storm Isaias in August of 2020. Now, what you're seeing on the screen is a snapshot. This is a several hundred-page decision, but we do spend some time in the decision recapping both the public comment that was provided from hundreds and hundreds of residents, as well as recapping the evidence that was provided by several First Selectmen and First Select women who pooled their resources together and formally intervened in this matter as witnesses. Now, I like to hold this up as one example of where public comment and party intervention has mattered, but it is by no means the only example. In this example, though, what I can say without a doubt is that the public comment that was provided, as well as the witnesses that came from the municipalities, they supported PURA's finding in this decision, where we issued the largest civil penalty allowed under law at the time, which was $28.4 million directed to Eversource. And without the evidence that was provided by individuals as well as those municipalities, I can say without a doubt we would not have had the evidence to support that decision. So one of the most frequently asked questions I received over the past couple of years is, why is my delivery charge 3 times that of my supply charge? And the answer, as you might imagine, is complicated. I'm going to try to break it down for you here. What you're seeing on the screen is a snapshot of an Eversource bill. This explanation is largely transferable to customers of the United Illuminating Company as well. So what you're seeing on this screen here is the first page of what an Eversource bill looks like today. And as you can see, it's generally broken down strictly between supply and delivery. Now, the answer is your delivery charge is not actually 3 times your supply rate. What it is a complicated amalgamation of a couple of different charges that PURA has since recognized need to be broken down further so that folks, importantly, know what the cost drivers are of these different line items, as well as who regulates these different items. Because if you're sitting here thinking to yourself, well, does it really matter? Because PURA oversees all of the actions of the utilities. So why do I need to know? Well, unfortunately, the answer is PURA does not regulate all portions of your electric bill. In fact, we regulate an increasingly small portion of it. And it's important, in my mind, to understand what the drivers are of those costs, as well as who does oversee, if anyone, different components of your bill, so that you know who to go advocate before. So on the delivery side of your bill, it's actually comprised of 3 different buckets of cost drivers. The first is transmission, the second is distribution, and the third are public policy programs. Now, to the average person, you may hear the terms transmission, distribution, and think that those are synonyms. They're not. They're actually providing 2 different services. They're 2 totally different components of how electricity is delivered from point A to point B. The most easy way that I've found to describe the difference between transmission and distribution is to liken it to the roadway system. Transmission is a lot like highways. Transmission goes between states, and like a highway where cars are going at faster speeds, transmission is transmitting electricity across state lines at high voltages. Now that's compared to distribution, which is more akin to the road outside of your window where you're taking it from your house to the grocery store. That's much more like a distribution line. Those are the lines, the poles and wires that are stepping down the electricity from transmission voltages down to a voltage that can be delivered to your individual house and used at your home and business. So 2 different components of the system. They're also regulated by 2 different entities. Transmission, since it crosses state lines, is regulated by the federal government. So there is a federal equivalent of PURA known as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC for short, and they have oversight over that portion of your bill. The distribution component of your bill, this is PURA's bread and butter. These are the costs of recovering infrastructure that PURA has direct control over. And these are rates that are set through distribution rate proceedings. The third bucket under the delivery portion of your bill are covering the cost of public policy programs. Now, these, generally speaking, are programs that are enacted by the legislature and then deferred to PURA to implement through the utilities. So some examples of these would be energy efficiency dollars that are collected through your bill and then dispersed through various programs that are overseen by the state's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Other examples include the cost of providing energy assistance programs, a lot of our clean energy programs, and some of our programs to retain, for example, the Millstone nuclear plant. So those are generally costs, as I mentioned, that are codified or required by the legislature and then implemented through the utilities, generally speaking, as pass-through costs. So PURA does check the books of the utilities, particularly in an accounting practice, to make sure that the utilities are only recovering the costs associated with administering those programs in a reasonable and prudent manner. Those 3 delivery components of your bill are contrasted now with the supply portion of your bill. Now, supply, which can also be referred to as the generation components of your bill, these are the actual physical electrons that are representing the energy. So when you flip the switch, your lights come on. Now, the supply portion of your bill was deregulated by the Connecticut legislature in about 2 decades ago at this point. Now, we were not the only state in the country that decided to deregulate the generation sector. Roughly half of the country at that time decided to deregulate. And the theory there was that there could be adequate competition in terms of who was generating the electricity. Now, remember, these utilities are natural monopolies when it comes to the infrastructure needed to deliver the electricity. But the thought was, it doesn't matter who generates your electricity, and you can open that up to competition. Now, when you open something up to competition and you're exposing it to the market, that removes the need for regulation, in theory. And so when the legislature passed this deregulation law 2 decades ago, it removed PURA's oversight with respect to the supply. It also required the utilities, Eversource and UI, to divest their ownership in generation. So the generation that they are delivering to you today, if you are a residential customer that opts for standard service, it is a total pass-through cost. So Eversource and UI are going to the competitive wholesale market and procuring electricity on your behalf. And what PURA's role is relegated to with respect to this charge on your bill is simply making sure that the utilities procurement of the standard service product was done competitively and has not been marked up for any profit. Now, you're not required to take standard service from these utilities. In fact, when the legislature deregulated this market, what they did was empower customers to make a choice. You can either choose to receive standard service from these utilities, or you can choose to take service from what's called a third-party electric supplier. Now, historically, not many customers have chosen to shop around for their electricity generation provider. And that's because standard service has been relatively competitive over the past couple of decades. But for many of you, what you may have noticed was on January 1st, when the new standard service rates were announced, those rates skyrocketed in an unprecedented manner. Now, just to pause here to let you know, standard service changes twice per year. It changes on January 1st and on July 1st. And historically, the rates go up on January 1st and they go down on July 1st. And that's because, generally speaking, it is more expensive to generate electricity in New England for the first half of the year than it is the second half of the year. That's because for a number of reasons, it's due to a number of reasons, but most notably because our region is heavily dependent on natural gas to generate electricity, meaning that the rate that the wholesale market charges is highly dependent on the cost of natural gas. And what we saw due to global supply constraints and the war in Ukraine was trickle-down impacts to the wholesale rates that were being charged in the New England region, leading to a real spike in those standard service rates on January 1st. But as I mentioned just a moment ago, you have a choice. You do not have to accept standard service from the utilities. Instead, you can shop around for a third-party supplier. And I know that may sound daunting. It's another thing to remember in your day-to-day life, but there are tools out there that the state oversees and does interact with that we could recommend to you. One of those includes a website called ct.gov. On ct.gov are a number of different programs that you can look into for energy efficiency, other state programs. But most notably in the middle there is the Supplier Rate Finder, which is also referred to as the Rate Board. Now, once you go to this website, and again, I must urge you to go to energizect.com. Don't simply Google it, because there are a number of advertisements that pop up in your Google results. You need to go to the actual website, energizect.com. Once you navigate yourself to that rate board, you have a couple of different options. If you're an Eversource customer or a UI customer, you can then select whether you're a residential customer or a commercial customer. And you can input what your average monthly usage is. In turn, what that rate board does is populate a number of different offers that third-party suppliers are offering today. And it will tell you how that rate compares and contrasts to the current standard service rate. Now, I was on there just the other day, and there are a number of offers that are significantly more competitive than the current standard service rate. So what's the catch, you ask, because there's always a catch. The catch here is that, everyone is out there to make a buck. So you certainly need to mind yourself and read and review the terms and conditions associated with these supplier offers. PURA and the legislature have undertaken a number of initiatives over the past couple of years to really crack down and regulate the customer protections associated with these third-party offers. One of the things in particular is that the legislature acted to prohibit the charging of cancellation fees or early termination fees. So if at any point you decide, you know what, I no longer want to be served by this supplier, I want to go back to standard service, or maybe I want to go to a different supplier, that supplier cannot charge you an early termination fee, no matter if what they're advertising on the board right now is lock in your rate for X cents per kilowatt hour for 3 years. They are not allowed legally to charge you an early termination fee. Now, if you do choose to shop around, I would urge you to mark on your calendar 2 dates. Mark on your calendar May 15th and November 15th. Now, the significance of these 2 dates is as follows. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, standard service changes twice per year on January 1st and July 1st. We announce those standard service rates about 45 days in advance. So if you enroll with a third-party supplier today, you need to be mindful of May 15th and November 15th to make sure that the standard service rate that is announced is not more competitive than the rate that you're getting from that third-party supplier. If it is, and you want to go back to standard service, again, you can do so with no early termination fee incurred. And again, we have invested significant resources into monitoring the consumer protections associated with this market. We do not have control over the rates or the terms, we do not have control over the rates that are charged by these third-party suppliers. However, we certainly monitor and make sure that they are conforming to all the consumer protections that are embodied in law. Those enforcement actions have led to the issuance of over $12 million in fines in just the past couple of years. And finally, we do maintain a call center, a customer service center. You can contact us toll-free Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. You can also email us at pura.information@ct.gov, or you can send us a snail mail, or you can file a complaint online. We are receptive to any and all of those communication forms. Now, why or when should you call us? Well, you should call us if you are having a dispute with your utility or your third-party electric supplier or any other entity that we regulate. We want to first encourage you to contact that supplier or the utility and try to get them to resolve your issue first. If you're having trouble getting a satisfactory answer from them, or more importantly, if you're having trouble getting a hold of them, then we would encourage you to reach out to us and lodge a complaint. We do monitor those complaints and especially monitor trends. And we can open up formal investigations into any of these entities on the basis of one complaint, or particularly on the basis of trends that evolve. Now, earlier in the presentation, we talked about ways to file comments with us, particularly in dockets or investigations once they're opened. These are two separate avenues. The customer call center, which we talked about just now, is for individual concerns. You have a question about your bill or your meter, for example. If you have a comment about a matter that PURA is looking into, or you want us to ask questions of the utilities or look into something further in one of the dockets, that's when you would file a comment into the docket, either by showing up in person or emailing us. So in summary, we look forward to your engagement with PURA, whether that's by showing up to one of our proceedings and providing verbal comment or providing comments in writing, or if you need assistance with an individual matter dealing with your bill or any other aspect of your utility service, please do not hesitate to contact PURA. We maintain a call center that is available 8:30 to 4:30, Monday to Friday. We also accept complaints through an online form. We accept customer complaints or inquiries in writing or by email. You can email pura.information@ct.gov. That concludes our presentation. I want to thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you in our proceedings and in our hearing room. Thank you very much.